Vladimir Putin's unexpected announcement shattered the calm of early 2025, while deep inside Washington, CIA analysts scrambled to make sense of intercepted signals. Across Tehran, Iranian scientists celebrated what the world hadn't yet realized: a completed nuclear warhead. But behind the headlines, a shadow war was unfolding. A rogue faction within Russia's own military-industrial complex was pulling strings that could ignite global catastrophe. In early 2025, deep within the U.S. National Security Agency, an intelligence analyst flagged an unusual signal picked up by a reconnaissance satellite. The signal, a burst of encrypted data sent from a remote location in Iran to a secondary site near the city of Isfahan, wasn't just out of place. It was highly classified military code not seen before. What followed over the next 48 hours would shake the core of global security. Analysts quickly ran the intercepted data through a series of decoding algorithms. At first, it appeared to be just another scientific update from Iran's known nuclear research network. But hidden in the binary code was something chilling: a final phase report confirming the assembly of a fully operational nuclear warhead. The warhead wasn't just theoretical. The data included detailed schematics, yield calculations, and, most notably, field testing results from a secure underground site. What truly alarmed U.S. officials was the portability of the device. Unlike traditional nuclear weapons, this one was small enough to be moved discreetly, loaded into a truck or container, and deployed anywhere in the region. It was designed to evade satellite detection, thermal scanning, and even standard radiation sweeps. This was not just a bomb, nor its weapon of strategic mobility. Within hours, the discovery made its way to the White House Situation Room. The response was swift and silent. An elite task force was formed, drawing in specialists from the CIA, NSA, Pentagon, and Department of Energy. The immediate concern was not just Iran's capability, but how the development had escaped international monitoring. The International Atomic Energy Agency had no record of such advancement. Satellite images showed no recent construction at key Iranian facilities. Inspections as recently as late 2024 had revealed nothing out of the ordinary. Iran had somehow moved in total secrecy right under the nose of global intelligence. In confidential briefings, U.S. military planners were told to prepare for limited kinetic action, a phrase often used as code for surgical strikes. Cyber divisions launched simulations for sabotage operations, while drones shifted position over the Persian Gulf. Naval carriers in the region were placed on high alert. Behind the scenes, an invisible war was already being planned. But as the gears of military response began turning, something even more unexpected was about to unfold. Just as Washington finalized its strategy, a transmission from Moscow broke through every channel, delivering a stunning and deliberate announcement that would shift the crisis into something far more dangerous and unpredictable. The U.S. had uncovered a bomb. But Russia was about to detonate the truth. As the United States prepared to launch a covert response to Iran's shocking nuclear breakthrough, military and intelligence agencies worked around the clock. Surveillance drones hovered silently above key Iranian sites. Covert teams were dispatched to regional bases in Bahrain and Qatar. Cyber specialists were tasked with infiltrating Iran's internal command and control networks, aiming to blind the country's defenses just before any physical strike. Every move was calculated to eliminate the threat before it could be deployed, all without igniting a full-scale war. But just as Washington's plan reached its final stages, the crisis took a dramatic and unexpected turn. In the early morning hours of January 17, 2025, Russian state television interrupted regular programming with a special broadcast. Flanked by senior military leaders and scientists, President Vladimir Putin addressed the world. With a calm, confident tone, he confirmed what many feared but none expected to hear so openly: Russia had helped Iran fast-track its nuclear program. It was not a denial, nor was it veiled in vague diplomacy. It was a direct statement of involvement, delivered with unmistakable intent. Putin claimed that Russian military satellites, high-energy physicists, and classified data had been supplied to Tehran under what he called a strategic defense partnership. According to him, the move was designed to create a regional balance of power and was fully sanctioned by the Russian Federation. He declared that any foreign military action against Iran would be considered a direct attack on Russian interests, promising severe consequences in return. The statement stunned global leaders. It didn't just escalate the crisis, it completely rewrote the rules of engagement. In Washington, the announcement sent operations into paralysis. Briefings were halted, orders were frozen. The implications of Russian involvement weren't just strategic, they were existential. A covert strike on Iran could now provoke direct retaliation from Russia. That possibility shifted the calculus entirely. The mission was no longer about eliminating a threat. It was about avoiding a global conflict between nuclear superpowers. Allies were confused. European leaders reached out for clarification, many caught between support for the United States and fear of Russian reprisal. NATO entered a silent panic. Israel, faced with what it viewed as a direct existential threat, placed its military on the highest level of alert. Fighter jets were scrambled, submarines repositioned, but the U.S. now faced with an even more dangerous geopolitical puzzle: advised restraint. The world had just watched Iran become a nuclear state. But now it was clear this wasn't just about Iran. Something larger, darker, and far more calculated was unfolding. One that had been in motion long before anyone noticed. The world reacted with disbelief to Putin's declaration. In the hours following the broadcast, news networks across every continent shifted into non-stop coverage. Analysts debated motives, historians warned of Cold War echoes, and diplomats scrambled to decode the broader implications. For the United States, the shock wasn't just in the admission. It was in the confidence behind it. Putin had essentially admitted to arming a volatile regime with nuclear weapons and dared anyone to intervene. The U.S. National Security Council convened for an emergency session. Intelligence chiefs warned that any further action against Iran could now trigger a direct Russian military response. The Pentagon began rerouting aircraft carriers away from the Strait of Hormuz and quietly canceled the covert mission that had been set to begin within 48 hours. The entire strategy had been flipped on its head. Washington wasn't confronting a rogue nuclear state anymore. It was facing a calculated chess move by Moscow-Israel. However, responded differently. Having long viewed a nuclear Iran as a red line, the Israeli government declared a national state of emergency. Reservists were called up. Anti-missile systems were activated across cities. Fighter jets patrolled the skies. The Israeli defense minister issued a chilling statement. "If the world refuses to act, we will." The words hung in the air like a warning shot. Tensions in the Middle East began to boil. Russia responded immediately. Within hours of Israel's declaration, Russian warships entered the eastern Mediterranean. Moscow released high-resolution satellite images showing Israeli air bases, along with a not-so-subtle message: any hostile activity toward Iran will be considered a threat to Russian security. It was the closest the world had come to open superpower confrontation in decades. Markets collapsed. Oil prices surged. Diplomats from neutral nations pleaded for calm. The United Nations held an emergency session, but no agreement could be reached. Some nations condemned Russia. Others, fearing retaliation or trade collapse, remained silent. China called for regional stability, but made no move to intervene. The global order appeared to be cracking under pressure. What began as a clandestine arms development in the deserts of Iran had now spiraled into a high-stakes geopolitical standoff. But behind the official statements and public broadcasts, something else was happening. Something even more dangerous. A growing number of intelligence reports hinted that parts of the Russian government may have been unaware of the full extent of the nuclear assistance. Whispers of internal disagreement and hidden agendas within Moscow began to surface. What looked like a unified move might, in fact, have been a mask for something more fractured and more threatening. As the global spotlight fixated on the growing standoff between Russia, Iran, Israel, and the United States, a quieter story began to take shape within the shadows of Russia itself. Inside Moscow's inner circles, confusion and tension started to brew. Publicly, the Kremlin presented a united front, firm, unapologetic, and prepared for confrontation. But beneath that surface, intelligence intercepts and insider leaks suggested that not all elements of the Russian leadership had been informed or involved in the decision to assist Iran's nuclear development. It began with small anomalies. Communications between high-level military officers contained unfamiliar code names and reference points that couldn't be traced through official chains of command. Surveillance of Russian military facilities revealed unusual movement patterns, scientists and engineers being flown into restricted zones, encrypted satellite relays being activated at irregular intervals. Western analysts noticed discrepancies between public military funding and actual resource deployment. Billions of rubles had been siphoned off into black budget programs with no visible outcomes. Then something far more alarming occurred. A senior Russian weapons engineer named Dr. Leonid Mirov vanished from his residence outside Novosibirsk. No official notice was given. His security detail was pulled without explanation. Hours later, an anonymous user posted a fragment of a classified Russian internal report on a hidden server, accessed primarily by intelligence watchdogs. The document referenced something called Project Zima, nuclear development effort, with no record in official archives. It mentioned collaboration with foreign agents, off-the-books funding, and experimental warhead designs. The source called himself Specter. This was no ordinary leak. The contents were too technical, the language too precise, and the evidence too damning to ignore. Intelligence agencies from multiple countries rushed to verify its authenticity. Within days, cybersecurity teams confirmed the metadata. The files had originated from a closed Russian military research network, accessible only to top-tier defense personnel. What followed was a flurry of activity inside Russia. Military leadership reportedly began internal investigations, though none were publicly acknowledged. Key figures in Moscow's defense sector canceled public appearances. A strange silence spread across Russian state media. The Whistleblower, still unidentified, released another batch of documents, this time outlining covert shipments of nuclear material that had bypassed standard Russian oversight. More troubling than Iran's involvement was the realization that powerful actors within Russia may have conducted an unauthorized nuclear project using Iran as a cover. The question now wasn't just about who helped Iran. It was about who inside Russia had taken control, its most dangerous technologies. The focus shifted from global diplomacy to internal conspiracy, and the implications were just beginning to take shape. As tension escalated worldwide, Specter continued leaking classified files, each more disturbing than the last. The documents began to paint a picture of an operation far more complex than anyone had imagined. At its center was not the Kremlin, but a rogue network embedded deep within Russia's military-industrial complex, powerful, secretive, and operating far outside the control of the state. The leaked materials detailed a project known internally as the Ghost Initiative. Unlike standard military developments, this operation was compartmentalized across multiple civilian and military sectors. Dozens of shell companies were created to launder funds and obscure the movement of materials. Nuclear scientists were recruited under the guise of civilian energy contracts. Satellite data from Russian military space programs was quietly rerouted to secret facilities in both Russia and Iran. This wasn't just a covert partnership. It was an independent power structure functioning in parallel to official state operations. Specter's files revealed that only a small circle of ultranationalist military leaders and ex-intelligence operatives were aware of the true purpose. Their motivation wasn't loyalty to Putin or the Russian state. It was ideology and ambition. This group believed that traditional warfare had become obsolete. They envisioned a new form of deterrence: small, mobile nuclear devices that could be distributed discreetly and used as leverage against world powers. The IRI plan was to place nuclear capability in unexpected hands, creating strategic chaos that would shift global control away from the West. Most shockingly, the documents revealed that Iran had only partial control over the warhead it was believed to have developed. Russian operatives embedded in Tehran's research program retained final control over activation and targeting protocols. Iran had unknowingly become both a client and a pawn. And worse, the project's scope wasn't limited to one device. Specter's intelligence confirmed that at least 3 fully functional warheads had been completed and transported out of Russian jurisdiction. Destinations unknown, these revelations caused alarm within Western intelligence circles. The United States and its allies were no longer dealing with a rogue nation, but a rogue faction inside a nuclear superpower. The idea that nuclear weapons were now in the hands of an untraceable group without clear allegiance was terrifying. It raised a chilling possibility. Even if global leaders reached a diplomatic solution with Iran or Russia, it wouldn't matter. The threat was now autonomous. Inside Russia, the Kremlin's silence grew louder. If Putin had known about the operation, it meant he had allowed an unregulated nuclear program to flourish. If he hadn't, it meant his grip on power was weaker than the world believed. Either way, the global order was beginning to unravel, and Specter had only begun to reveal what lay beneath. Another hinted at an undisclosed maritime transfer in the Indian Ocean. The third had no destination at all, just a blank field marked TBD. As forensic analysts pored over the data, they uncovered details of the design. The warheads utilized a newly refined form of enriched uranium known for its unusually low radiation signature. This meant that standard detection systems at ports and border crossings were useless. Moreover, the detonators were built to be remote sea-mingered using highly encrypted satellite relays, which could be activated by anyone with the correct authorization codes. Codes held by the rogue faction, not any official state. The Ghost Initiative had redefined nuclear deterrence. The very concept of nuclear diplomacy was undermined. If a warhead could be in any city, moved without warning and detonated without attribution, traditional defense strategies were meaningless. It was no longer about deterrence through visibility. It was control through invisibility. A hidden threat that governments couldn't track, let alone defend against. Meanwhile, global shipping companies and airport authorities were instructed to implement emergency screening protocols, but nothing effective existed. Behind the scenes, panic set in. Insurance firms froze policies for major urban centers. Airlines revised routes. Stock markets responded with volatility, and defense contractors quietly began ramping up production of counter-nuclear tech in Russia. No response came from the Kremlin. The silence was interpreted by many as fear, either of admitting complicity or of confronting a faction too powerful to contain. Some speculated that Putin had lost control. Others believed he was using the rogue group to carry out actions he could later deny. But what mattered now was this. Weapons of mass destruction were no longer symbols of state power. They were tools of chaos in the hands of individuals with no allegiance and no trace. The world had entered a new era. The ghost units had been released, and no one knew where or when they would strike. As the gravity of the missing warheads sank in, world governments struggled to regain control over a rapidly destabilizing reality. International alliances began to fray. The United Nations Security Council held a closed-door session, but internal divisions rendered it paralyzed. While the United States, the United Kingdom, and France demanded immediate investigation and sanctions, Russia's ambassador denied any wrongdoing, dismissing Specter's leaks as Western fabrications designed to frame the Russian Federation. China, walking a diplomatic tightrope, urged calm, but refused to take a firm stance. In Washington, intelligence chiefs gave the president a grim assessment. With the warheads untraceable and Russia unwilling or unable to cooperate, the situation had crossed into unprecedented territory. Covert operations were authorized to track the suspected transport routes mentioned in Specter's files. Navy submarines were deployed along undersea shipping lanes. Surveillance aircraft were dispatched across Central Asia and the Middle East. Despite this, no warhead was located. Every effort failed. The trail had gone cold. Meanwhile, Specter released a final message through a private encrypted forum. It contained the last batch of leaked documents and a statement that shook intelligence communities worldwide. "You've been looking in the wrong place. The threat isn't foreign, it's internal." The documents included classified Russian internal correspondence, suggesting that elements within the Kremlin had actively worked to suppress knowledge of the Ghost Initiative, even among their own senior officials. It wasn't a rogue operation hiding from the Russian government. It was being quietly protected from within. The implications were devastating. It meant that any hope of pressuring the Russian state into compliance was futile. The protective barrier around the initiative wasn't just bureaucratic, it was intentional. With factions shielding each other inside the Russian chain of command, the Ghost Initiative had become a state within a state. There was no clear enemy to confront, no nation to hold accountable. Backdoor diplomacy began to collapse. European nations, fearing exposure to an invisible nuclear threat, began closing borders and activating civil defense protocols last used during the Cold War. The European revelations seized the moment to solidify its regional influence. With one nuclear weapon already confirmed and more suspected to be in play, Tehran held military parades showcasing advanced missile systems, claiming they now had the ability to strike any city in the region within minutes. The message was unmistakable. Iran had joined the nuclear club, and it was ready to use its new power. Neighboring countries responded with growing alarm. Saudi Arabia, long a bitter rival of Iran, accelerated its own nuclear ambitions. The kingdom reopened enrichment facilities under the pretext of energy research, but made no attempt to hide its military interest. Intelligence sources confirmed the arrival of Pakistani nuclear scientists in Riyadh under highly secretive arrangements. Meanwhile, Turkey shut down its airspace to all Israeli and Western military aircraft, citing concerns over unauthorized preemptive actions. Qatar and the UAE issued travel warnings and began stockpiling emergency medical supplies and radiation shielding equipment. Israel, caught between strategic paralysis and existential fear, began taking drastic steps. Military conscription was expanded. Evacuation plans for major cities were quietly rehearsed under the guise of disaster preparedness drills. Submarines known to carry nuclear-tipped missiles disappeared from public tracking systems. Intelligence analysts observed Israeli fighter jets flying dangerously close to Iranian airspace, testing limits, measuring reaction times, and sending a warning that Israel's patience was running thin. Amid the chaos, global intelligence networks began picking up strange activity. Unregistered vessels were seen shifting course in the Indian Ocean under false flags. Private jets made unlogged landings in small, unregulated airstrips across East Africa and Southeast Asia. Security footage from a port in Georgia, on the Black Sea, showed a crate marked with radiation hazard symbols being loaded onto a truck, then vanishing from all satellite tracking within hours. It became clear that the warheads were moving, not to Iran, but elsewhere. These movements suggested a terrifying possibility. The weapons were not for national use but part of a global smuggling operation. The Ghost Initiative wasn't just about empowering one nation, it was about destabilizing many. With trust between allies eroding and the risk of nuclear exchange growing, smaller nations began quietly considering their own nuclear programs, fearful of being left defenseless. The regional powder keg had been lit. The nuclear threat no longer sat in missile silos or behind fortified borders. It was shifting, hidden, ready to surface anywhere. The Middle East was no longer just a flashpoint. It had become the first front in a new kind of war. As the movement of the warheads became clearer, global intelligence agencies began a frantic race against time to track the nuclear materials before disaster struck. In the shadows of this high-stakes pursuit, a network of underground arms dealers, smugglers, and corrupt officials emerged as the hidden facilitators of the Ghost Initiative's reach. These shadow players operated beyond borders and laws, leveraging illicit trade routes spanning continents to move weapons and materials with chilling efficiency. Operatives discovered that some of the warheads had been broken down into parts, nuclear cores separated from their delivery systems, to avoid detection and later reassembled in undisclosed locations. Satellite surveillance spotted suspicious activity near remote warehouses in Central Asia and Eastern Europe, but any attempts to raid or intercept were thwarted by local forces, unwilling or unable to cooperate. The blurred lines between criminal enterprise and rogue military faction made it impossible to pinpoint responsibility. In one crucial breakthrough, an undercover agent embedded in a Balkan smuggling ring uncovered plans indicating that a reassembled warhead was intended for shipment to a major European city. The shipment was disguised as industrial machinery, slated for transfer through a busy port with lax security. The intelligence was rushed to Western agencies, but by the time a task force mobilized, the container had vanished from all records. The realization dawned that the rogue faction's strategy wasn't just about creating fear, it was about control through uncertainty. The possibility that any major city could harbor a hidden nuclear device brought governments to the brink of panic. Emergency response teams were placed on constant alert. Intelligence sharing agreements were intensified, but mistrust and secrecy slowed cooperation. At the same time, the whistleblower Specter disappeared from all known channels. Attempts to contact him failed, and speculation grew that he had been silenced or gone into deep hiding. Without Specter's leaks, many feared that the truth of the Ghost Initiative's full scope would remain buried, while Moscow remained silent. Rumors circulated that internal power struggles were intensifying as factions within the military-industrial complex fought for control. Putin's public statements became less frequent, and behind the scenes, a mysterious purge targeted key figures suspected of knowledge about the rogue operation. The world was left in a precarious balance. The threat of invisible nuclear weapons, hidden in plain sight, hovered over cities and governments alike. The old era of nuclear deterrence had given way to a shadow war, one fought in secret corridors, unmarked warehouses, and through layers of deception. The question no one dared to ask was when, not if, the next shock would come. The world had been thrust into a new and terrifying reality, one where the traditional rules of nuclear conflict no longer applied. Governments grappled with the knowledge that nuclear weapons had slipped beyond control, hidden away in places no one could predict. The Ghost Initiative had shattered decades of stability, and the countdown to an uncertain doomsday had begun. With no clear enemy or safe strategy, global leaders faced a grim dilemma. Military action risked triggering catastrophic escalation. Diplomatic efforts faltered under layers of deception and mistrust. Intelligence agencies operated in a state of constant alert, chasing shadows that vanished before they could be caught. The invisible threat hung over every major city, every key port, every strategic hub. Amid the chaos, ordinary people lived in quiet fear. Governments issued vague advisories about emergency preparedness, but without details. News coverage grew sporadic, overshadowed by political posturing and diplomatic brinkmanship. Panic was contained, but anxiety simmered just beneath the surface. In the absence of transparency, underground movements and private security forces expanded their influence. Some wealthy elites began investing heavily in private intelligence networks. The global economy wavered as markets fluctuated on rumors of potential attacks and retaliations. Insurance companies refused coverage for nuclear damages. Supply chains were disrupted as countries tightened border controls and scrutinized cargo with unprecedented suspicion. Behind the scenes, secret negotiations took place. Back-channel talks attempted to broker understanding between major powers, but trust was thin. Russia's official position remained ambiguous, refusing to acknowledge the rogue faction but showing no effort to dismantle it. The United States and its allies debated covert operations to neutralize the threat, but feared the consequences of failure. Meanwhile, intelligence agencies continued to monitor for signs of activation codes or movement of nuclear materials. The countdown was silent and invisible. No alarms, no warnings, just the ever-present fear that at any moment the world could be plunged into devastation. Specter's final leak remained a haunting reminder of the shadow war beneath the surface. Whoever he was, his warnings had forced the world to confront a nightmare once thought impossible, that nuclear weapons could exist beyond the control of any government, held by those who answered to no one. As 2025 unfolded, the question on everyone's mind was clear but terrifying. How long before the silent doomsday arrived? The world waited, breath held, for the next shockwave in a crisis with no clear end.